Up next on Book TV, Afterwards, with guest host Craig Whitney, author of Living with Guns, A Liberal's Case for the Second Amendment. This week, Emily Miller and her first book, Emily Gets Her Gun, But Obama Wants to Take Yours. In it, the Washington Times columnist argues that the Obama administration has an anti-Second Amendment agenda and plans to create a national gun registry with the ultimate purpose of confiscating firearms. This program is about an hour.
I'm happy to be here with Emily Miller, whose book just came out today, Emily Gets Her Gun, But Obama Wants to Take Yours. It describes, Emily, what happened after you decided in late 2011 that you wanted to get a gun in the District of Columbia, where handguns had been forbidden until the Supreme Court decided in the District of Columbia versus Heller case in 2008 that a handgun ban was unconstitutional, because the Second Amendment, according to Justice Antonin Scalia's majority opinion, quote, surely elevates above all other interests the right of law-abiding, responsible citizens to use arms in defense of hearth and home, unquote. So you'd think it would have been straightforward in 2011, 3 years later, for you to just go out and buy a gun, but it wasn't. Tell us why you wanted one, and tell us what happened when you took the first steps towards getting a gun.
Well, I wrote this book out of reaction to what has happened this year as the gun control laws that are in D.C. have spread through the country. Basically, since the horrific tragedy in Newtown, Obama, and mostly funded by Mayor Bloomberg, has pushed these laws sweeping the country. And I had just gotten a gun myself in D.C. and saw in action how these gun control laws affect the law-abiding people. So while it took me 4 months and $435 in government fees to get a gun that I still can't legally take out of my home, in other states you just walk into a gun store and you do an FBI background check and you walk out. So we've got gun crime rising in D.C. In fact, rapes and sexual assaults were up 50% a year ago. Last year, assaults with a gun were up, robberies with a gun were up 20%, assaults with the guns were up. So all these gun crimes are going up, and people like me, the law-abiding, are having trouble getting a gun. And so why I wrote this book is because these laws are being spread around the country, and it's not going to do anything to reduce crime. It's not going to do anything to make Americans safer.
Well, describe a little bit what exactly, how it came out in practice when you tried to buy a gun. You go into great length in the book, but give us a sense of what were the absurdities that you faced when you tried to actually do it.
Well, I was so overwhelmed by it. I went into the police station to start, and I just said, I'm here to get a gun. Because I had no idea. I never owned a gun before. What inspired me is I was a victim of crime. I was walked into a home invasion situation, and thankfully wasn't hurt. But there were a bunch of men outside. The police say most likely they had done a drug deal and they were trying to get some quick cash. I wasn't hurt, but it woke me up to the fact that if I had surprised them enough or something had happened, I was totally defenseless in my home. So that's what inspired me to do it. And I knew that, obviously as a Washington resident, I knew that the Supreme Court had overturned the 30-year gun ban, but I didn't realize what had happened since then. What happened was the liberal city council had to technically abide by the Heller decision, technically. Mm-hmm. But what they did is they put in place these incredibly complicated registration laws. So D.C. is one of the 7 places in the country you have to actually register every gun you own, mostly like Chicago, New York, places like that. And they do it, I believe, to discourage people from law-abiding people from getting guns. Of course, criminals are just buying them off the streets from each other. So that's what they're up to. And I didn't realize any of this going into it. I just thought I'd get a gun. I knew it was a little bit hard. I ended up, after I walked into the police station that first day, I said, I'm here to get a gun. And I got all the paperwork, 22 pages of paperwork. And I was so overwhelmed by it, I sat down and tried to figure out what I had to do. And it was 17 steps. 17 things you had to go through. It actually ended up being about 22. I counted 17 and found more as I went along, but some of the most ridiculous ones was a 5-hour test, a 5-hour class I had to take, 4 hours in a classroom, just to be read the laws out loud.
Not to learn how to shoot a gun, but to learn what the law is.
Well, it was 1 hour in the range, which wasn't learning to shoot, because that's not part of the requirement. It was just showing that you could hit the paper from 5 yards. And frankly, you'd have to be blind and deaf to not hit a piece of paper from 5 yards. It was not very telling. I had to take a written test, a 20-question test, fingerprinted, ballistics test. I mean, it was one thing after another. I had to go to the DMV twice, which anyone who's been in the DMV in any major city knows that in and of itself is a deterrent, having to go down there. And so, getting the gun transferred into the city was a hassle, everything. So it ended up, as I said, took me 4 months.
Well, they did challenge, I think, Dick Heller, the defendant in the original case that went to the Supreme Court, challenged those rewritten rules, but they were upheld in a federal court. What's happened since then?
Yeah, the Heller 2 decision, it's being appealed, and that's working its way through the court system. And I think I was pleased to see last year, through the course of my series coming out, the City Council moved to make the registration process a little less difficult, and I count it now as 11 steps. Mm-hmm. So it's not 17, it's 11. And I mean, obviously, the leverage that I had in writing this series and sort of scaring them is this pending case, because they don't want to get it back to Supreme Court and get knocked back down again. And DC's other big, and this is just a very DC-centric issue, is they want to have budget autonomy away from Congress, and they want to be a state. And they know the Republicans in the Congress are not going to allow either of those things while they have these unconstitutional firearms laws existing. So that's why they've moved in the past year with my series to change 2 of the laws. Your
series in the Washington Times.
In Washington Times.
Which was also called Emily Gets Her Gun.
That's inspired me. Take away from Annie Gets Her Gun. So that was a series.
Well, the laws that you describe and the absurdities they can result in are very similar to those in effect in New York City and Chicago. Not in very many other places. When you say that you saw President Obama try to get similar laws passed around the country, or perhaps you meant in different states after Newtown, there were laws passed that tightened up the regulations on gun possession, and a lot of those are not very similar to those in the district, though.
They are. I mean, the same laws are all over the place. This assault weapons ban. So 5 states passed new laws, and from Colorado, which was the most shocking of all, which will be facing a recall election next week over it, and a lawsuit, which a high-capacity magazine ban now exists in Colorado. That threw me off 2 weeks in the Washington, D.C., because the Sig Sauer is the brand of gun I chose, and it came standard with a 13-round magazine. That's just what it does. So the best prices are online, but I couldn't buy it that way because it came with this 13-round magazine, and the one gun dealer in D.C. was illegal for him to even receive it that way. His name is Charles Sykes. So I had to find a dealer who would be willing to take the factory box, open it up. And by the way, a 10-round magazine and a 13-round magazine look like this, but the 13-round one has a little piece of plastic here that stops it. Right. So this is what's going to be going on in Colorado. And this also happened this year in Connecticut. And then, obviously, we're sitting here in New York City. The first one out of the gate was Governor Cuomo, and he pushed this through, which supposedly was written by Mayor Bloomberg, this ridiculous law saying that the maximum capacity magazines in New York State could be 7. Well, no one checked to find out if any guns were made with 7-round magazines, and they aren't.
Not many are, yeah.
I think it's the 1911 pistol and a couple of small guns. So then they had to, because of that, they had to do a whole new fix in April to change that. And now they're saying, which I think is the most ridiculous thing of all, you can only load 7 rounds. I mean, can you imagine the criminals being like, dude, you hit 6, stop. Right. You're almost at 7.
Well,
and it's not going to do anything.
You've hit the nail on the head with what the problem that so many people have with gun control is that so many gun control laws, which may be well-intentioned, seem to be based on the idea that the best way to reduce murders, assaults, armed robberies, and other crimes involving guns is to make it as difficult as possible for everybody, including law-abiding citizens, to own or use a gun. New York City has the same idea. You've already criticized Mayor Bloomberg, who pushes that constantly and is now going to do it across the country. Right. Would you agree, though, that, first of all, the Second Amendment protects a constitutional right? It recognized a common law right that everybody had in the colonies right up to the Revolution, and it aimed to protect that. And that people who see that guns can be dangerous or a menace to public safety have to recognize that people who take that right seriously deserve to be taken seriously. I mean, very often it's kind of dismissed. Well, it's a relic.
Right.
I'm sure we agree on that. Would you also agree that gun control laws that aim to keep guns out of the hands of people who everybody agrees should not have them, criminals, drug addicts, people like that, people with criminal records, such rules are acceptable if we could ever agree on common ground?
That's the problem. That's the whole problem here. Is we've had all these studies, government studies, CDC, Harvard, one after another on the gun control laws, such as universal background check, assault weapons ban, high-capacity magazine, registration, carry ban, all of those kinds. None of them reduce crime. In fact, crime has decreased. Gun crime alone has decreased 40% since 1991. So the past 20 years, gun crime is down 40%. Or gun murders are down 40%.
All kinds of crime are down about
all
that.
All crime is down. But if we're just going to talk about firearms, it's completely down. However, we have the more guns in this country than we've ever had in history. There's 300 million guns in this country. So as and especially the past year with what's been going on in the gun sales, firearm sales are going like this. Gun crime is, okay, I can't do this very well. But you know what I'm trying to do. Right. So one is paralleling. So gun crime is going down while gun ownership is going up. So if we want to reduce, and it's about 10, 11,000 people are killed each year by gun crime. About a quarter of those are felons and criminals. Not much we can do in that case. So about
more are killed. They kill themselves in suicides.
That's for psychologists to figure out that situation. But if we're just talking about people who are murdered, who aren't criminals themselves in acts, about 7,000, I'd say we want to work on that issue, even though it is decreasing. There are so many things that can be done that are already in existence that obviously, like you said, that the Gun Control Act of 1963 says if you are a felon, you can't have a gun. If you're mentally ill, you can't have a gun. If you're a drug dealer, domestic abuser, dishonored discharge from the military, illegal alien, any of those categories of people, it is illegal for them to have guns.
Right. That was 68, but
68. Thank you. You're so much better at the history stuff than I am. I appreciate that. So we have these and we all agree. I mean, does anybody want a criminal or a drug addict to have a gun? I mean, the whole point is that
the question is, how do we
all want to be safe.
How do we make laws that do that and don't penalize?
Well, we have a law that does that. We have a law that says that. It's about making those laws effective and enforcing. I think the biggest solution that needs to be done is getting the mental health records into the NICS system. And NICS is obviously the FBI's background check system. When you go to buy a gun, they do a check, and they see if you are in those prohibited categories.
The NICS system is the National Instant Criminal Background Check system that applies to sales of guns by federally licensed dealers in gun shops or
Retail.
gun shows,
right?
But not to private sales, which might be 10, 15, 20, or even 40%. The estimates range widely.
Obama says 40 because that's convenient for him, but that number is one of the things I talk about in my book is such a falsehood because first of all, it's taken from, as you know, a study from 1997. So what do we really know about modern stuff? So it's that old. But of that, 28% are friends and family. So I'm not going to give my gun to my uncle who's a drug addict and is abusing his wife. Like, if it's friends and family, you know each other. This has been happening through the course of American history.
You might not, but suppose you're a criminal and you get your gun from a friend or a family.
Well, that's what they do. I think it's 40% get them from their friends and family. But they're probably criminals as well. I mean, they know who they are.
And they're not going to be deterred by a law, in your view, that
or they
makes
wouldn't
that
be criminals. Thus we call them criminals because they don't really care.
Right.
Like we all try. Like I am the one going to the DMV to get my gun.
But how about the people who get straw buyers, girlfriends or friends?
That's a tough one.
Who can buy guns, to go out and buy them somewhere and then give them to them illegally.
Right. And that's a very common. The ATF puts that at 47%. That's a huge number.
So that's that many criminals get their guns that
from
way.
Straw purchasers.
Right.
And what that is
sale, isn't it? I mean, if it's a sale.
No, it's basically what it is like you send your girlfriend in because she doesn't have a felony record or drug addiction, and she buys the gun. Now, the key to that is one of the other things I say is one of the solutions that we really can focus on that's already law is the crime in going through your NICS check and failing it is lying. So when that girlfriend goes in and says, I'm buying this gun, and she's writing out that form, that's a perjury charge. And so the only way to stop these things is for enforcement of those perjury charges. And the problem with this administration is they don't see that as a priority. I mean, Eric Holder, Attorney General, said, we don't have time for this. I interviewed Jim Baker he was the NRA Director of Federal Affairs, and he was in a meeting at the White House. They had one meeting where they had the gun groups in when they were developing their agenda. And they'd known each other for years, Biden and Baker. And Baker said to the Vice President, with all due respect, prosecutions are down in your administration of these perjury charges, of these NICS fails checks, these NICS denials. You've got to go after this. This is how we get these guys off the streets and stops them. And the Vice President says to Baker, we don't have time to go with these petty charges. So that disconnect is such a problem because in order to stop people from doing straw purchases, there has to be a deterrent. Mm-hmm. If the girlfriend thinks what happens, how the process works, the FBI does a denial, figures something out, and sends it to ATF. The girlfriend thinks she might actually go to jail for 5 years over this. They might stop her. And secondly, you also get people like that off the streets when you go after them. You know, these are criminals already. We know that. So the only way to stop them is to know that there's a deterrent. And
well, I think a lot of people on the gun control side of the debate would agree with you on that. After Newtown, the president, of course, reacted, as many people did in the country, to that horrific slaughter of innocent children by letting or proposing a number of measures, including administrative measures that he can take without congressional action. But he asked for, and Congress eventually considered on April 17th, the Senate considered a bunch of different proposals, amendments to an underlying gun control law. And they all failed. One of them was, of course, a ban on that Dianne Feinstein had proposed on semi-automatic so-called assault rifles, like the one that Adam Lanza, the killer in Newtown, used to shoot the kids with. But others, there were other measures. One of them was a bipartisan measure that Senators Manchin and Toomey and Schumer had proposed that would make universal background checks a requirement. Another one was a proposal to criminalize straw purchasing and make it punishable by 15 years in imprisonment. Yeah. Another one was a law against gun trafficking, bringing guns across state lines, criminals bringing them across, and that was also to be punishable by
strengthening. Again, these are already against the law.
Already there, but they wanted to strengthen them. Yet all these amendments failed to reach 60 votes, which were required under the rules of the debate that day. Why would people who actually support strengthening such laws oppose them when they came to a vote in the Senate?
Well, as I explained in my book, there were two different trains moving down that track in the Senate. What happened in Newtown was, as you said, slaughter. I don't know what other word to use. Just one of the most horrific things I think that ever happened in America, and shattered everybody. And what I find to be unfortunate is President Obama has had this anti-gun control agenda planned, as has Dianne Feinstein, since before he was reelected. These legislation had been in the works, and they announced them all within 2 days of these children being killed. I mean, to me, it's shameful that they use this opportunity to push a political agenda as opposed to saying this is a horrific, horrific thing that happened, but there is no law that would have stopped. This killer, Lanza, broke every law. He stole his mother's guns.
Murdered her.
He murdered these children. He went on a gun-free zone school. I mean, if there was a law, he broke it. And so when it came to this time, and Obama pushed this because he really needed to get the momentum, and he had Mike Bloomberg's money behind him. Mike Bloomberg spent $12 million leading up to that election to plastering ads around this country on senators he thought he could switch on his direction. And I sat through all those hearings on the Hill. Not one person on the Democratic side or I shouldn't say, because it really wasn't split down party lines. It was the Democrats were split and the Republicans were on one side. No one said this law would have stopped Newtown. It never came up because it wouldn't have. So they're exploiting them without saying that we could stop our children from being saved in schools.
Exploiting them is one way to look at it. Having a normal human response to a horrific tragedy is another way, isn't it? I mean, give Obama a little credit. He didn't just come out and try to pass a slew of gun laws because it had always been on his agenda. I would dispute that, incidentally.
In 48 hours.
No, it wasn't so fast.
It was on Sunday at the prayer service.
He didn't come out with the actual
on that Sunday, the shooting was on a Friday. Saturday morning, Bloomberg said, we need to pass an agenda now.
Bloomberg said that.
Sunday morning at the prayer service, Obama said, I'm going to launch a task force to look at
right, which Biden chaired.
Why?
It took a while, though, didn't it?
No, he said I want it within a month.
Yeah, but it wasn't 2 days after the tragedy.
He switched to politics in 2 days. Instead of letting these kids' bodies are still in school. I mean, this is like,
if you're going to strengthen legislation, even some that's already on the books, you've got to do it through politics. How else are you going to get it passed by Congress?
Well, I found it shameful because not one thing that was proposed would have prevented those children's deaths.
And I agree with you on that.
And I think he agrees with that. And that's the kicker to it.
None of these measures could have stopped Adam Lanza.
Because you've got crazy people. And look, mass shootings, there's another confusion with the public. And I try to clarify that in my book. Mass shootings get media coverage like nothing else.
Because they're spectacular and bloody and horrifying.
And I think people relate to them more than city crime. Whereas people in the city, urban crime is much more frequent.
And that's the big problem, not the mass shootings.
Exactly.
I agree.
But the way the politicians go after these mass crimes and make mass shootings go after them, and the media as well, the public has this misconception that mass shootings are increasing. And the Congressional Research Service did a study this spring, looked at them for the past 10 years, said they're exactly the same. Some years we have, unfortunately, horrifically more, but it's about 18 people a year. And so one of the things, I think it's important for people to know, because, I have my girlfriends come to know that, I'm an expert on this issue, and they are terrified to send their kids to school. And that's going back to what you were saying about the president. And as I would have loved the president to, instead of making it worse and exaggerating and making people more scared, say to the country, this is this is a one-off. I mean, talk to the families, but then if he's speaking to the country, your children are safe. You're not in more danger. First of all, 1/3 of the country's public schools have armed guards already. So those schools we know have a deterrent. And mass shootings are not getting worse. You can go to, if I'm at Aurora, you can go to the movie theaters, go to the school. Where I'm having my friends
and maybe
terrified.
then he might have said, and let's get together and talk about things we might be able to agree on that could at least help make these things less frequent. One of them is, two of these are things that Wayne LaPierre of the NRA actually came out and supported after the president made his proposals public. One is armed guards in school, and as you said, a lot of people said, "Oh, that's ridiculous." Just think turning the schools into repositories for guns. How's that going to keep people safe? And yet, as you just said, 1/3 of all schools across the country have armed guards already.
And when it's schools of 1,000 or more, which obviously the urban, more dangerous ones, it's in the 60 percentile. And so, Wayne LaPierre made that comment, and the people who were outraged by it were mostly the liberal media.
And another comment he made, Wayne LaPierre, was, we've got to do something to improve the way we detect and treat mental illness of the kind that clearly was behind Adam Lanza's actions in Newtown. And that actually was part of the universal background check proposal that Manchin, Toomey, and Schumer proposed. Lots of measures in there to strengthen the ability of the states to use information they get from treatment of mentally ill people and to make it available, make the names
FBI,
of such
right.
people available to the FBI for the national check system. Yet that, too, failed to make 60 votes.
As did Grassley-Cruz was the alternative, and those Republican, sponsored by Senator Ted Cruz and Chairman, ranking Republican Grassley on the Senate Judiciary Committee. That's the one the Republicans stood behind, and a bunch of Democrats because it didn't have this universal background check. And the problem with this, I say in my book that universal background check is sort of the assault weapons ban of this year. The assault weapons ban was created by an anti-gun activist deliberately, and we have his own words, Josh Sugarman, saying people will mistakenly think when we talk about assault weapons that there are automatic weapons, meaning the kind you take in war, machine guns. He said exactly what he said. They'll think it's machine guns. This is a really great way to make inroads with people because the public will be confused and they'll think they're outlawing machine guns. They'll also wrongly think that machine guns are on the streets. Now, you also have the President of the United States all this year, repeatedly, we've got to get weapons of war off the streets. We've got to get machine guns off the streets. He said, actually, at one point, those poor children in Newtown were killed by semi-automatic, fully automatic guns. He actually corrected himself to mislead. And
like it's wrong.
Incorrect.
Yeah.
And, part of what I'm writing this book is just to get facts out there, is machine guns or true automatic guns, which is you pull a trigger, as many bullets come out until you stop,
right,
are at war. They're in Afghanistan. Our military has them. Some of our police have them. For civilians, they've been highly regulated since 1934. They're not used in crimes. Because they're so rare, they haven't been manufactured in 30 years, they're very expensive.
But there's 500,000 of them or so in private hands.
Yeah, and that's a good point. There's 500,000 in private hands, and they're never used in crimes.
Well, it sounds like you support that ban.
Well, I think there are reasonable things. Obviously, there are reasonable limits. We don't want felons. Frankly, I don't want a criminal having a fully automatic weapon. Like, we don't want an Adam Lanza having a fully automatic weapon, but I don't think he can afford $20,000, $30,000 to get one, and an ATF check, and because $200 fee, and there's a lot to go through.
So that control has been effective on keeping that kind of weapon out of the hands of everybody, practically, not just criminals, but everybody. It was originally aimed at criminals, the mob,
right,
back in the days of Prohibition.
Right, and that's why they have but part of that whole thing, that law. I actually was at the ATF about a month ago. They let us shoot all the banned guns.
Did they?
So much fun.
It is fun. I've
so much fun.
shot a semi-automatic version of the AK-47, which I heard a lot coming the other way when I was in the war in Vietnam. But
right.
It's more fun to be on this end of it than on that.
For me, that was one of them we shot. They only wouldn't let us shoot in automatic mode, but I was like, how in the world are they walking around the world with these things? They're so heavy, But one of the things was the Tommy gun in there, and I'm like, this thing weighs 10 tons, and it's this big, and that's another misconception. People think because Obama's saying weapons of war on the streets.
Well, he did say
no one's walking down the streets with rifles.
He did say at one point, these aren't the problem. The problem is criminals using cheap handguns.
He said that in the debate last year, which I went
debate with Mitt Romney.
Okay, so now we're going to go after
what's wrong with that. It is
price
true.
Point?
No, he said they're cheap handguns, but
yeah,
but he wasn't trying to get the price raised.
Well,
he was just pointing out that they and not semi-automatic rifles are the
which
main
is
problem.
fine. He's never proposed any kind of, thankfully, yet proposed regulating. But in 1996, when he was running for Illinois State Senate, he wrote in as a questionnaire on a variety of issues and said, "Do you support the banning of handguns?" He wrote yes.
That's back before he ever became a national figure, of course.
Right, when he had to run a national election.
But in his first term, what did he do on gun control?
Well, he couldn't because he was running for re-election. Gun control is a loser. It's a loser issue.
You don't give him any credit at all for maybe just responding the way a normal human being would to the massacre
Barack Obama
in Newtown.
No. That man has been political. He was born political, and he has a political agenda. Now, look what happened to Clinton. Clinton pushed through the 1994 crime bill or assault weapons ban, whatever you want to call it. He lost the House. House has been pro-gun ever since. Most of this country, 40% of this country has a gun in the home. 47% of the country has a gun in the home. This is a country that believes in the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. Politicians know they can't win a national election bashing guns.
Okay, we'll take a short break, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
On the Go, Afterwards is available via podcast through iTunes and XML. Visit booktv.org and click Podcasts on the upper left side of the page. Select which podcast you'd like to download and listen to Afterwards while you travel.
Wayne LaPierre who was the executive vice president of the NRA, testified before the House Judiciary Subcommittee in 1999 for closing the loophole that allows private gun sales not to go through the national instant check system. He said back then, "We think it's reasonable to provide mandatory instant criminal background checks for every sale at every gun show. No loopholes anywhere for anyone." What do you suppose happened to change his mind, and why would you argue now that it's a bad idea to have universal background checks even for private sales?
Well, I don't speak for Wayne LaPierre. I'm not a spokesman for the NRA, but I will say why I think the Manchin-Toomey, which we were talking about earlier, amendment could not get 60 votes in the Senate, is because, well, first of all, as you know well, the source of guns for criminals is not through private exchanges generally. This is, they're getting them off the streets, they're getting them in these straw purchases. I mean, what it affects is the law-abiding. And, they use this gun show loophole rigmarole all the time. And they've interviewed, the Department of Justice interviews regularly, polls people in jail, and I guess they tell the truth about where they get their gun. And it's like 1% say at a gun show. And, there's this because
calling it the gun show loophole is a misnomer. I agree, because at gun shows there are lots of licensed dealers. And
at this point, I talked to the head of the Gun Show Association, and because ATF has been even more regulating than normal, obviously the last 2 years, it's up to about 90% at gun shows. And I think that gun show loophole is another phrase that was invented to confuse the public, and especially places that culturally there aren't gun shows, they're not used to it, like the Northeast and places like that. And places like for Virginia where they have gun shows all the time, people go and they know it's not like a hotbed of criminals running around shooting each other. But to someone who just doesn't know the issue and is maybe a suburban mom, isn't familiar, it does sound a little bit scary. But it's not a source of criminal guns. And so the reason that they could not get 60 votes in the Senate is because the Grassley-Cruz alternative was a way to, like as we said, strengthen the straw purchasers, get those mental health records into NICS, all these kinds of things, strengthen the prosecutions of the denials, those things that are like solutions that people agree on. Whereas Manchin-Toomey was saying, hey, we live next door to each other, but we're going to have to drive all the way down the street, find a gun dealer to do an FBI check. And frankly, and I put this document in my book, there's a memo that was written at the Justice Department. I've asked the Justice Department repeatedly who they wrote it for, where it went, but they won't say. The NRA got a copy of it. And in it, it says that background checks, universal background checks, which is their new vanilla term, will not do anything to reduce crime unless we have a registration of all the guns in America, and the public overwhelmingly opposes a universal registration.
I think you overstate that. I was drawn to it, and I think it's a good thing that you did publish it in the book so people can see what it says. It was analyzing what universal checks could do, and it says they're insufficient for ensuring that firearm owners remain eligible. You can legally own a gun, but then go commit a bank robbery or something and become ineligible if you're convicted of the crime. And there's not a good mechanism for checking back on people like that.
Right.
And it does say that most states do not have a registry of firearm ownership, so consequently, it's hard to go back and find out if you're getting the right people, if you're doing universal background checks, barring the right people from guns. But it doesn't anywhere say that we need a federal system, a registration system.
Just go down to the very bottom, gun registration, continuous checks. Universal checks are insufficient for ensuring, blah, blah, blah. Recovering guns...
next to last paragraph, or last paragraph.
Right, recovering guns from those that become ineligible is likely effective.
Right.
Okay, there's evidence from 3 studies. Let's get through that.
At the end, it says...
The challenge is implementing...
That's it.
More broadly, is that most states do not have a registry of firearms ownership. Currently, NICS background checks are destroyed within 24 hours.
Right.
That's by law in Congress.
Right.
Some states maintain registration of ownership. Gun registration aims to, 1, increase owner responsibility by directly connecting an owner with a gun. That's a national registry.
Right.
2, improve law enforcement's ability to retrieve guns from owners prohibited from possessing firearms.
Right, but that's
confiscation.
That doesn't say they want federal gun registration.
Yes, that's exactly what it says.
Existing
gun registration also allows for the monitoring of multiple gun purchases in a short period of time.
That's what it does. That's just a statement of fact.
Well, this is the recommendation.
It's not a recommendation. It's a statement of fact.
Firearm violence prevention strategies by the Deputy Director of Justice Department, National Institute of Justice. I mean, they have a little Twitter summary on these things. So the Twitter summary on universal background checks, effectiveness depends on the ability to reduce straw purchasing, requiring gun registration, and an easy gun transfer process.
In states where they have it.
It says it down. Well, we can disagree on that.
Well, I think you go too far.
You do? Well, I don't. Because I believe, I look back at Obama's career and I see him from the beginning saying, I want to ban all handguns. And not just in 1996. When he was running for Illinois Senate, he expanded on it that I would like to ban handguns. So there's a history here of this. And then when he got into the Senate, he was one of only 30 members who voted for regulating of ammunition. Of course, that's
is true. But in his first 4 years as president, what did he do? Two things. One, sign a law that lets you take a gun if you own one aboard in a container aboard Amtrak trains, and two, take a gun into a national park. Right. That's all he did.
Because he wanted to get reelected, and no one's ever gotten reelected who's run on gun control or elected, I should say. To
I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where people who support gun rights, and I'm one of them, I believe it is a constitutional right, and I wish that people who support gun control, like Mayor Bloomberg, would take that more seriously than they do. But you'll never find common ground. There must be things we can agree on, like improving mental health records and making sure that states provide the names of people who shouldn't be able to buy guns from dealers, get into that federal FBI registry. We'll never be able to make progress on that and make things like Newtown, if not impossible, at least maybe less likely to happen, unless we stop calling each other names and throwing slogans at each other, and I think that's all they did in the Senate in April 17th. It would surprise me to learn that anybody besides Manchin, Toomey, and Schumer had actually read any of the legislation that was being discussed.
I don't think Schumer did because, he threw his name on at the last minute, and I don't think they did because it came out the day before.
He was working on a proposal like that
No,
months
he had
before.
one. They pulled it in, and the Senate passed the Schumer one that didn't even go to the floor, and they knew that. I mean, that's how rushed this thing was, that they took a bill that they knew was never going to go to the floor and made people vote on it, saying we're going to change it later in committee, and then rewrote this one late at night.
Our gun politics has become really sloganeering and not an attempt to wrestle with the serious issues at hand. Isn't it legitimate to want to protect the right of the public to live in safety with all the 300 million guns that we have around in the country? I mean, every gun owner would agree on that.
That's why they have a gun, so they're safer.
Well, and shouldn't there be a way that we can talk to each other about these things rationally and try to find common ground rather than say, you're proposing gun control, you want to ban guns, you want to take my guns away, I'm not going to talk with you.
Well, but it's only coming from one direction. It's coming from the Obama-Bloomberg side. They're the ones who have this agenda. I think you and I would agree there are enough laws on the books that exist. Enforcing the laws is the issue. We're not enforcing them correctly. Not one person I've heard this year has said, here's a new law that will actually make the world safer and the country safer and you safer. There are so many laws already, and they're not being enforced. People aren't being prosecuted. But I also think the push for gun control has very little to do with public safety because gun crime, as we've discussed earlier, is dramatically down, and it's gone down every year. Went down this year. It'll go down next year. It's going down. So things are actually working. So why this became the number one issue of the Obama administration this year, why this became the number one issue of the Senate, in all of March and April, it's all they talked about, when people are safer now than ever, and it's it's not an epidemic.
People fall back on their core beliefs. Bloomberg, for instance, right now is arguing that the stop and frisk practice of the New York Police Department, which he keeps saying is
Very
responsible
effective.
for that decline.
He's right. I agree with him on that.
Murders are only a quarter of what they were 20 years ago in New York City.
Yep. And that's, those things do work, and I agree with Bloomberg on that. Stop and frisk. If you see someone's about to commit a crime, find out if they have illegal guns.
But it's impossible that Stop and Frisk is responsible for all of that, because it also went down in about the same proportion, even in the District of Columbia.
No, they're not down in D.C.
No, they are way down from where they were in 1992.
Of the exact length of time, yes. But
all through the country, every crime has gone down.
Well, there's several factors to play. I mean, actually, there's more than several. There's about 12. But the major ones are mandatory sentencing for gun crimes, stronger prosecutions, more policing on the streets. I mean, those are the things that really get these guys off the streets and get illegal guns off the streets.
And programs like one that you mentioned in your book, ceasefire programs, which they have in I believe, in Washington and in Chicago and other places. This is where the police and others work with people who've been members of criminal gangs, who've gone straight or have served time in prison and seen the error of their ways, to come back and talk with young people who belong to gangs about how self-destructive it is to rely on guns for pride and security and so on.
There's so many and that's the thing, is the issue is so complicated. It's not going to get boiled down to one or two simple fixes. I mean, you've got lack of they're not graduating from schools in the inner cities. I mean, most of these crimes are inner city crimes, not graduating from schools, don't have hope for the future. Plus all the other things. There's just a lot at play.
And most of the victims of violent gun crime are the black and Hispanic people in poor neighborhoods.
Disproportionately, obviously. Yep, absolutely. And, and that's not what you hear President Obama talking about, and that's not what you hear. I mean, Mayor Bloomberg has spent tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars this year, and you're not seeing him representing the kids on the streets, the ones who are really the gangs.
And I think his policy has, while its aims may be well-intentioned, it's been badly carried out by inexperienced police officers who offend more people than they stop and frisk, than they explain to them, we're trying to protect you.
Yeah, and stop and frisk is a tough issue because, you have to guard between the right to keep and bear arms and Fourth Amendment right of searches and seizures versus you see a bad guy who looks like he has a gun, so let's make sure he doesn't have a gun, but things like that do help reduce crimes in cities. But, as far as just overall, where you have crime going down, gun crime dramatically going down, decreasing, why is this become such a national agenda? The president talks about it just 3 days ago, passed two more executive actions on completely pointless, on importing of historic guns that are 50 years old and things like this. It's just become such a political issue, but yet when the Justice Department releases a study in May saying crime is down so much, non-fatal shootings are down 70% in 20 years, the White House is silent. Bloomberg's silent. In fact, I called his office and I said to Bloomberg's office, I said, are you guys going to release anything? Are you going to talk about this? And they said, they're using other weapons.
Well,
and things are much better in other countries.
On the other side of the debate, people also talk out of both sides of their mouths on this issue. I mean, the NRA, you don't speak for the NRA, and I'm not trying to force you to, but they're constantly telling members like me that they need more money to fight off proposals that would keep me from buying guns and people like me from buying guns. And you need a gun because, the police can't always be there and crime is still a problem in our big city. Well, it is, but as you point out, it's a half or a quarter of the problem it was 20 years ago. So why keep spreading fear-mongering, basically, about, if not just to sell guns? That's what the gun control people say the NRA is really doing, is selling guns.
Right. And it's such a silly... The person who is selling the most guns in history is President Obama.
You point that out in your book.
I call him the best gun salesman in history.
Exactly.
The gun... I'd go through sort of some of the public companies and the private companies. Remington or Freedom Group, which is one of the biggest. Their sales were up 56% last year. And just during Obama's term, some of the public companies...
all the way through.
Everyone is... Biggest number of NICS checks has been since Obama announced his agenda. Because here's what happens. You start to say to people... People love their AR-15s. It's the most popular rifle in America now. I think there's 5 million of them around there. And to be clear, in all of the 11,000 or so people who are murdered by firearm each year, there are about 300 murdered by rifle of any kind, whether it has a pistol grip or collapsing stock.
It's handguns, basically.
It's handguns. Yet, Obama, from the day one of this tragedy, we need an assault weapons ban, and then pushed through Dianne Feinstein's bill, couldn't even get 40 votes because everyone knows this has absolutely nothing to do with crime.
I think myself that if they hadn't pushed for the ban on semi-automatic rifles, some of these other measures might actually have passed.
I think they needed to divide them up. By clumping them together, it became so partisan. But if you had picked out pieces, and the problem is for everyone I talked to who's familiar with the White House Legislative Affairs offices and Senator Reid's office, is President Obama was just pushing so hard to get a vote on this. And he actually, from what I understand, believed he could get to 60. Harry Reid never thought he could, but Obama really thought he could.
Well, Harry Reid didn't want the ban to be proposed in the first place. But just to tease you a little about your subtitle, Obama wants to take your guns. You got your gun, but he wants to take ours, you say. Even the ban that was basically Dianne Feinstein's proposal didn't involve seizing automatic rifles. It required semi-automatic rifles. It required registering them and increase the fees that it would take to do that. But there was never any mention of seizing anybody's guns. It made sales difficult. That's true. But seizure, I didn't see anywhere in the law.
First, I would point out, again, that memo we both were pulling up earlier says a registration, which is what they would do. A registration would help law enforcement take guns that's confiscating your guns.
But federal registration of guns is specifically forbidden by law.
But this is what they're recommending based on the Obama agenda, Obama's gun control agenda. It is forbidden, as it should be, because...
And it was forbidden in that amendment that Schumer and Toomey and Manchin proposed.
But here's the thing. You've got the IRS targeting conservative groups. You've got the NSA spying on all of us. We know that now. They're going through our emails, going through our phone records. No one anymore believes the federal government when they say we're not keeping records of you. No one.
That's a good point.
If you do, you're being spied on. Let me wake you up here. I have the bottom of my emails now just hi NSA, because I just know they're hi Eric. So that's we are living in a year, especially this year, when all these scandals come out of how outrageously invasive the federal government is in our privacy. So if you're a gun owner, I'm a gun owner, I am a gun owner, and my gun is registered because Washington, D.C. has this law, so they know about my gun. I have zero doubt that they will like to go back to the ban, and if they go back to the ban, my gun will not be grandfathered in, and they will want to get it back.
Well, I'd wonder why they would see any use in going back to the ban. One of the more fascinating figures in your book, and I've forgotten the exact number now, is how few people have gone through the process you did and actually bought and registered guns and handguns in the district since 2008.
It's about 1,500 a year.
Something like that.
Yeah, it's very low.
Nothing. And that no crime has been committed with a gun that was legally registered in the district.
Because
they're all being committed by unregistered illegal guns.
The thugs are not going to go through 17 steps. They're not going to take a 5-hour class, which we got eliminated last year. They're not going to, can you imagine the criminal being like, I'm sorry, can I go to the police station? I need to take my 20-point question test before I get my gun. I mean, it's just ridiculous. The only people who are doing it are the most law-abiding. And I'll tell you, most people in D.C., because they tell me, normally law-abiding people who have guns don't register them because they don't want the government to know about them. They don't want to go through the hassle. So it's the whole mandatory registration process. First of all, the country opposes it. It's a very unpopular concept because no one trusts the federal government. But even in the states that have them, guns aren't being registered. It's just the stupidest thing. And then they have this ballistics test of mine. So technically, if my gun is stolen, they can track it back to me. Now, how is that going to solve a crime? The gun was stolen. I went through 17 steps, and you'd have my fingerprints twice, and an FBI background check, and a DC background check. You can be pretty sure you don't need my ballistics to track a crime down.
And these draconian regulations also claim innocent victims. You describe several of them very effectively in your book. Tell us a couple of those stories that you described in your book about people who fell afoul of the district's gun laws and had no idea they were violating any law at all.
Right. It's really hard stories to hear, to touch. Three of our recent veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, I profiled in my book. Because DC's gun laws are so crazy, they just don't exist anywhere else. And I've actually asked different gun control groups. Not all of them, because I get very defensive over DC having the worst gun laws. And I'm very competitive over this.
I may cede that point to you, yeah.
I'm like, we don't have the right to bear arms. So I always trump them on that, because the Chicago people will be like, we have it bad. I'm like, we don't have the right to bear arms at all, because they just got in July.
You can't take them out of your apartment.
I'm like, I win again, worst gun laws. So I am defensive on the fact that we have the worst, but the point is that most of the country, you don't have crazy things like, so I was talking about Lieutenant Augustine Kim. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan. In fact, I was just emailing with him today. He just got back from Kosovo. He's just a dedicated, wonderful soldier. And Lieutenant Kim was, and I would say, legally transporting his guns through D.C. They were locked, unloaded, and cased in his trunk. He had been injured in Afghanistan, and he had left his guns while he was there at his parents' house in New Jersey, and he went to pick them up, and he was driving them back to his home in South Carolina. And he stopped at Walter Reed for a checkup of his injuries, and in doing so, got lost, got turned around. That part's a little bit complicated story, but got pulled over. And the D.C. police claim that by stopping for medical treatment, he was no longer legally transporting, just that one stop, because D.C. police was wrongly giving out what the federal transport laws are on guns. And to just clarify, if your gun is unloaded and locked in your trunk, you can drive to state, and you can stop for gas, and you can stop to eat. That's fine.
But he stopped at
and
the
medical
hospital.
treatment. That's also
broke the chain.
Yeah.
For the D.C. police.
Wrongly. And I think if it had gone to trial, he would have won, but, they settled. But here's the thing. This man, Lieutenant Kim, who's been serving our country bravely, injured, they threw him in jail, and he had to get a lawyer. They threw him in jail for the night, which is horrific. Handcuffed him, threw him in jail for the night. He had to get a lawyer. He had to go through this, and he took a plea deal where he had it suspended, and after a year, dropped the charges. Active duty. I mean, this man, why are we charging him? Unloaded guns in his trunk. We sent him to Afghanistan with guns.
He's a lieutenant, right?
He's a first lieutenant. He's still serving. And then DC seized his guns and wouldn't give them back for 2 years. Until I wrote the story repeatedly. Senator Lindsey Graham read my story, called Police Chief Lanier, it's his constituent in South Carolina, is like, give him back his guns today. So after 2 years, Lieutenant Kim got his guns back. And I'll tell you another story, briefly. Sergeant Corrigan, who did not register his guns which is normal in the rest of America, you don't. And his thing was, I can't believe that I would just walk up to the police station and they wouldn't just arrest me, which is very reasonable. I know a lot of people are worried about that. His guns were unloaded, locked and cased in his house, and I go through the whole complicated story of how the police SWAT team barreled into his house and seized him. They put him in jail for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. He had served in Iraq. He actually had some PTSD symptoms from Iraq and couldn't sleep. I mean, what are we doing? These aren't dangerous people. These are people that we give guns to go across the world and protect us and protect freedom. And Specialist Meckler, the other story I go to, he was thrown in jail for possessing rounds of ammunition, no gun, because these are the laws. And I'll tell you, I talk a lot to the rank and file police in the union, and Chris Bowman, who's head of the union of the police in D.C., I talk to him frequently. He's in my book. They do not support any of this. They do not support these laws. And if you look nationally, Police One did a survey of 15,000 law enforcement. 85 to 95% of all of Obama's gun control agenda are opposed by law enforcement. The reason is because they're doing things like wasting time chasing out a Specialist Meckler or chasing down Sergeant Corrigan when they could be going after the actual criminal who just mugged the girl walking down the street with a gun or just, knocked her to the ground. I mean, law enforcement opposes all of these things. And, as well as many times as Obama has press conferences with police standing behind him, the police are not standing behind him because they support this. Those are the appointed police chiefs of big cities who are appointed by these liberal mayors. They are not these law enforcement, the real guys on the streets who are going, as Officer Bowman says to me, Emily, do I want to chase you because your 13-round SIG has a 10-round mag, or do I want to go after the guy who just shot someone on the corner? This is why law enforcement is not supporting these measures.
You describe in your book how you ran into Justice Scalia, who wrote the opinion that made handguns legal finally in the District of Columbia, at the White House Correspondents' Dinner this last spring. And you said something to him about how you hoped that he would help you get the right eventually to bear arms as well as keep them in the district. Tell us a little bit about what he said, and what do you think is going to happen in that regard?
Well, my friend Shannon Bream covers the Supreme Court for Fox News, and so she was talking to him and introduced me, and I mortified her for life. Like, I'm sure she's never going to introduce me to anyone again, because I was a complete super fan. I was like, you wrote Heller, thank you so much. You gave me the right to get a gun. It was you wrote it. And he was like, thanks, crazy lady. But I said, because the D.C. is the last place that you do not have the right to bear arms. You can't take your gun out of their home. And in July, Illinois legislature finally passed a law because the courts forced them to, finally passed a law allowing. It was the last state where you couldn't do it. Right. And so I said, are you going to bring up we call them, a carry case or bear case in the near term? Because look at this court, it's a 5-4, we still have the Heller majority, but until you guys make a decision, places like D.C. aren't going to do this. And I'll also say, I didn't say it then, but to him, but all through this country, all 5 of these states that have passed gun control this year are all facing lawsuits. New York, Connecticut, Colorado. And they're all going to wind their way up to the Supreme Court, I have no doubt, because limiting what you can carry has not been decided yet by the court. So those are 2 things that I just am very hopeful it happens while the majority is still a pro-gun majority. And so I just asked Mr. Justice Scalia if he was taking care of himself, if he was exercising regularly. And then Shannon pointed to he said he was laughing nuts, and he said he was. And then she pointed to his tuxedo pocket where he had a cigar, and she was like, what is this? And he said, only on special occasions. And I was like, Mr. Justice, we need you healthy.
To get to the point where we can talk with each other across the divide that divides people who support gun rights and people who support gun control, to get them to talk to each other about things we could agree on that might make it safer to have all the guns we have, takes, I think, a recognition by each side that the other holds its views seriously. It isn't just in it for the politics or political advantage. But, when you react to Newtown by saying there must be something we can do, pass a law of some kind.
Right. And everybody feels that. Isn't it universal?
It's not just politics. It's a human
response.
I
totally agree with you on that point. I mean, it's so universal. I mean, all I want to do is think of a way to protect those children. I mean, we all want to do something. That is human nature. It's like, let's do something. What can we do to stop this from ever happening, and how can we protect our children? And I mean, I was a Sunday school teacher in his 1st grade, so I've been in that classroom. I know that age group. It is such a horror. However, legislation cannot be made based on our human emotions. It has to be made based on policy, evidence, and fact. And that's why these things don't get very far in Congress, because once the emotions die down, they're elected to. Well, and I also think if we did this in a way it was people like you and me and not politicians who could reasonably talk to each other a lot more. Politicians are always going to stick to their guns.
Let's hope
pun intended.
Let's hope that can happen someday. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
That was Afterwards, Book TV's signature program in which authors of the latest nonfiction books are interviewed by journalists, public policymakers, legislators, and others familiar with their material. Afterwards airs every weekend on Book TV at 10 p.m. on Saturday, 12 and 9 p.m. on Sunday, and 12 a.m. on Monday. You can also watch Afterwards online. Go to booktv.org and click on Afterwards in the Book TV series and topics list on the upper right side of the page.